about the future of the planet, the survival of the human race.
Oh, that old thing.
And besides, we're being followed.
Well, it's a park, isn't it? Followed.
Mr. Chaplin, don't make a fuss. I'm strong, highly trained and merciless, and I'm coming into this house. I want that tape.
Which tape?
I do not waste words.
I've started a civil disobedience campaign. 6 of us boycotted the bus trip to Skegness last week.
They're back. The school teachers on the trail of mystery, intrigue, and all that jazz.
The Futurists were a group of artists in Italy during the early part of this century. Their motives and beliefs are explained shortly on Channel 4 in Vita Futurista. Meanwhile, here on YTV, it's time for the news from ITN.
The news from ITN.
Doctors hit back at the government over the NHS. Geldof says 5 million could starve to death in Ethiopia. The men from Lord's fly to Pakistan to support Mike Gatting. And down but not out, the micropilot heading down under. Good evening. There's more concern about the National Health Service than ever before, according to a new opinion poll tonight. It says 22% of the general public now see it as an urgent problem. That's more than twice as many as when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1979. The poll by Gallup for the Daily Telegraph tomorrow also shows 88% against the government plan to end free dental checks, 89% against ending free eye tests. The Health Minister, Mr. Tony Newton, today denied the NHS was in crisis, but said new thinking was needed from all sides. The British Medical Association rejected criticism from government sources that restrictive practices and entrenched attitudes of consultants were stopping the health service getting better. They said the government weren't being responsible.
I think they're not giving enough money towards the health service. Perhaps they've decided that they're not going to, but then what we want them to do is come out honestly and say that they're not going to give the money.
And do you think they're just diverting attention by attacking you at the moment?
I think that they are, and I think it's a great sadness for us because, as I say, we're dedicated to the health service and we want to help them to run it, and to attack us is not the right way to get at demoralised doctors anyway, who are demoralised by the cuts, and start blaming them because they're not providing enough money.
A survey for the Royal College of Nursing today says 1 nurse in 5 has to take a second job to make ends meet, and most nurses have to work overtime. And the National Union of Public Employees, which represents about 80,000 nurses, claim tonight that nurses are low paid because their jobs are seen as women's work.
7:15 a.m. Staff nurse Helen Vines arrives at Poole General Hospital. The 36 patients on the orthopaedic ward are cared for by 1 ward sister, 2 staff nurses and 4 students. The patients are mostly elderly and need a lot of care. The report says many nurses feel they don't have enough time to communicate with their patients. The Royal College found 60% of all nurses work overtime, and it's usually unpaid. This saves the health service £166 million a year. And 20% of nurses moonlight at other jobs, usually with nursing agencies. Most say they need the money. Today, Helen has time for lunch, but it's regular for nurses to work through meal breaks. She's been qualified for 5 years and takes home £583 a month, including extra pay for nights and weekends. On her days off, she admits she works for a nursing agency.
Yes, I do, I'm afraid, but out of necessity, really. That's what most of us used to sort of live on. The basic pay that we get is not really enough.
Helen has now worked 8 hours and finished her shift, but there's still work to be done. At last, after an hour's unpaid overtime, time to go home.
Good night, staff.
Good night.
Now the Royal College say unless pay and conditions improve, there will be an exodus from the nursing profession.
British women harmed by an American contraceptive coil, the Dalkon Shield, expect to get damages fairly soon after a court ruling in the United States. A judge ordered the maker's A.H. Robbins Company to set aside more than £1,300 million for compensation worldwide.
The Dalkon Shield was fitted in thousands of women all over the world. Initially, it was thought to be a safe, effective form of birth control. But by 1974, its American manufacturers had taken it off the market. A year later, Britain banned the device because the tail of the coil often disintegrated, causing pelvic infection and even infertility. Some women had hysterectomies, many more suffered psychological scarring. Susan Walker is one of 3,700 British victims who sued for damages in the United States. She almost died from an infection.
I was actually very seriously ill. Another 24 hours, and the infection would have got into the bloodstream, and that's fatal.
Are there women in Britain today who are still using the shield?
Yes, I mean, 6 months ago I had a letter from a woman who was still using the shield and had been advised by her doctor that there was no problem, that she needn't have it out.
Do you think that was good advice?
I think it's horrific advice. It is a time bomb, and the more time that passes, the more dangerous it becomes.
Although one Midlands health authority organised a campaign to identify women who'd had the shield inserted, it's believed thousands more who've suffered have left it too late to claim compensation.
Bob Geldof returned to Britain today after a visit to famine-hit areas of Africa, warning that 5 million Ethiopians could die from starvation. And he launched a fierce attack on the atrocities he says are being committed by anti-government rebels in Mozambique.
Bob Geldof came home shocked by the brutality of the war in Mozambique and warning of another disaster in Ethiopia.
I think there's a ferocious famine coming, aggravated by a war. There are, again, about 5 million people affected. It's actually worse conditions than 84, 85, and that the drought failure is worse, the crop failure is worse.
From the Ethiopian refugee camps, Geldof went to Mozambique, a once fertile country ravaged by famine and civil war. There, he heard stories of attacks on children by South African-backed rebels.
They roam around the country. They are organised, and they inflict absolute terror. Their targets, first off, are clinics and schools. One chap, his aunt was stopped by bandits and asked where the militia were, that's the policeman. And his aunt didn't know there were bandits and brought them to his house. They took his father out and shot him in front of him. Then they came back to the house and asked where his father's friends were. And he said he didn't know, so they took his hand out and they cut off his little finger with a blunt knife. He wouldn't tell him. And then they cut off his ear, he still wouldn't tell him.
Despite the twin horrors of famine and war, Geldof says Band-Aid is making some impression.
You know, I was absolutely amazed to be in places that I had been a year ago where there was nothing. And now there was these fantastic things going on and still going on. So, you know, all that stuff about, I said that, listen, these people, if you help, will stay alive, and they will keep being alive because of what we're doing. That's true.
Greater Manchester's Chief Constable, Mr. James Anderton, has said criminals should be flogged until they repent. He's quoted in Woman's Own magazine as saying corporal punishment should be administered so that they actually beg for mercy. He said, I'd thrash some criminals myself, most surely. And he says, I could punish people quite easily. Police hunting 2 prisoners who escaped by helicopter from Gartree jail say they could now be in Spain. Both men, John Kendall and Sid Draper, are thought to have associates on the Costa del Sol. Detectives say the trail here has gone cold. The opposition candidates in South Korea's presidential election have accused the government of bribery and vote rigging to win Wednesday's poll. Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam are locked in a tight race with the government candidate No Tae-woo, with no front-runner emerging. The election was called after violent anti-government protests in June.
So long denied them has brought South Koreans out in their millions. As the campaign builds to a climax, a sea of yellow banners shows the size of support for one of the favourite candidates. Opposition leader Kim Dae-jung offers a release from repression. Kim preaches peace and an end to military dictatorship in Korea. This massive turnout for his last major rally in the capital, Seoul, shows the scale of interest in this election. In the race to be president, the other main opposition candidate, Kim Young-sam, drove the length of the country today, canvassing votes. Many believe the failure of the 2 Kims to unite will damage their chances of toppling the ruling party. But Kim Young-sam seems to have just as big a following. From dawn till dusk, the campaigning never lets up. The man they're both trying to beat is the government's champion, No Tae-woo. The former army general who helped his friend President Chun Doo-hwan seize power 8 years ago is now trying to win friends as a moderate man of the people. few politicians in the world can attract such crowds, though the numbers game gives little clue to Wednesday's winner. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, South Korea.
Prime Minister Wilfred Martens of Belgium appears to be heading for defeat in the country's general election. Early computer predictions show that his centre-right coalition could lose its 18-seat majority to the opposition socialists. Nearly 250,000 people marched silently through Saragossa in Spain today to mourn the 11 people who died in Friday's car bomb attack. They carried banners calling for an end to terrorism. 4 children were killed in the blast outside an army barracks. Basque separatists have been blamed. 5 Palestinian protesters and 6 Israeli soldiers were injured today in further clashes on the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Stone-throwing youths were fired on by troops during the 5th day of riots, in which at least 6 Palestinians have died. England's top cricket officials are on their way to Pakistan tonight, insisting there's no question mark over Mike Gatting's captaincy. Alan Smith, chief executive of the Test and County Cricket Board, says he has every confidence in Gatting. In Pakistan, there's a new row over umpires for the next test. One of them's thought to be the man England complained about during the first test in Lahore.
Chief Executive Alan Smith and Chairman Rahman Sabaro are flying to Pakistan in the extraordinary position of having to quell a rebellion in their own team. It was their orders to apologise that so upset Gatting, but tonight Mr Smith said there's no question of the captain being sacked.
I have every confidence in Mike Gatting as captain. I don't think that we're talking about in the sense that we've got any question marks on it.
Do you see
everybody's a human being, everybody makes mistakes.
In London, former Pakistan captain Imran Khan spoke for the first time about the row. He said the Pakistan authorities were getting their own back. If the English board had upheld Pakistani objections to umpire David Constant last summer, then the umpires England have complained about wouldn't be on the field.
I think it was a sort of retaliation. I'm sure if the objection against the English umpire were upheld, then Shakur Rana would not have been appointed.
He says the only way forward is neutral umpires, something Pakistan have always called for.
The Pakistani players feel that when they go abroad, when they complain against the umpiring, it's either whinging or bad sports. When touring teams come to our countries and when they complain about the umpiring, it's cheating.
The naming of another controversial umpire, Shakil Khan, for the third test could now cause further problems. Gatting complained about him during the first test, and tonight Alan Smith said he'd back the captain if he opposed Shakil's appointment. Mark Austin, ITN Sport.
Today's Soccer Now in the Barclays First Division, the results: Coventry 0, second place Arsenal 0, Forest 4, Queen's Park Rangers 0, that's a hat-trick by Nigel Clough in 4 minutes, Tottenham 0, bottom club Charlton 1, and in Division 2, Crystal Palace 2, Sheffield United 1. Microlight pilot Brian Milton said tonight he'll continue his solo flight to Australia tomorrow, despite being grounded by an accident in Greece. He's attempting to fly from London to Darwin in 30 days, but his aircraft was blown over on the island of Kythera. Tom Evans at ITN reports.
When Brian Milton took off 11 days ago, his greatest fear was that he might be shot down in the Persian Gulf or eaten by sharks. Not for one moment did he think he'd face any major problems in the early stages. But his optimism quickly faded. Storms and engine trouble in France failed to stop him, but powerful crosswinds in Greece did.
I was running out of fuel on the way through to Crete, and I diverted to this little island of Kythera, which is a notorious black spot as far as winds go. And I came in to a very rough air, but to a very safe landing. And immediately afterwards, the wind caught under my right wing and just flipped me straight upside down. And ever since then, we've been pulling bits and pieces of the Dalkon flyer to pieces so that we can put it back together again.
Brian Milton insists he'll reach Australia on time, but the most hazardous parts of his journey are still to come.
Finally, Prince Charles took his sons for a walk in the country today, and they couldn't resist making friends with the swans. The birds are spending the winter at the Slimbridge Sanctuary in Gloucestershire. Prince Charles and his sons were there to adopt a swan called Rain under a sponsorship scheme. But as Prince Charles strode forward, Prince Harry had to be restrained by a detective from getting just a little bit too close. And that's the way the news looks tonight. From all of us at ITN, good night.